Chapter 13, Part 3 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 13, Part 3. Matho had at first refrained from fighting, the better to command the barbarians all at once. He had been seen along the gulf with the mercenaries, near the lagoon with the Numidians, and on the shores of the lake among the Negroes, and from the back part of the plain he urged forward masses of soldiers who came ceaselessly against the ramparts. By degrees he had drawn near. The smell of blood, the sight of carnage, and the tumult of clarions had at last made his heart leap. Then he had gone back into his tent, and throwing off his cuirass had taken his lion's skin as being more convenient for battle. The snout fitted upon his head, bordering his face with a circle of fangs. The two forepaws were crossed upon his breast, and the claws of the hinder ones fell beneath his knees. He had kept on his strong waist-belt wherein gleamed a two-edged axe, and with his great sword in both hands he had dashed impetuously through the breach. Like a pruner cutting willow branches and trying to strike off as much as possible so as to make the more money, he marched along mowing down the Carthaginians around him. Those who tried to seize him in flank he knocked down with blows of the pommel. When they attacked him in front, he ran them through. If they fled, he clove them. 2 men leaped together upon his back. He bounded backwards against a gate and crushed them. His sword fell and rose. It shivered on the angle of a wall. Then he took his heavy axe, and front and rear he ripped up the Carthaginians like a flock of sheep. They scattered more and more, and he was quite alone when he reached the second enclosure at the foot of the Acropolis. The materials which had been flung from the summit cumbered the steps and were heaped up higher than the wall. Matho turned back amid the ruins to summon his companions. He perceived their crests scattered over the multitude. They were sinking, and their wearers were about to perish. He dashed towards them. Then the vast wreath of red plumes closed in, and they soon rejoined him and surrounded him. But an enormous crowd was discharging from the side streets. He was caught by the hips, lifted up and carried away outside the ramparts to a spot where the terrace was high. Matho shouted a command, and all the shields sank upon the helmets. He leaped upon them in order to catch hold somewhere so as to re-enter Carthage, and flourishing his terrible axe, ran over the shields, which resembled waves of bronze, like a marine god with brandished trident over his billows. However, a man in a white robe was walking along the edge of the rampart, impassible and indifferent to the death which surrounded him. Sometimes he would spread out his right hand above his eyes in order to find out someone. Matho happened to pass beneath him. Suddenly his eyeballs flamed, his livid face contracted, and raising both his lean arms, he shouted out abuse at him. Matho did not hear it, but he felt so furious and cruel a look entering his heart that he uttered a roar. He hurled his long axe at him. Some people threw themselves upon Shahabarim, and Matho, seeing him no more, fell back exhausted. A terrible creaking drew near, mingled with the rhythms of voices singing together. It was the great Helepolis surrounded by a crowd of soldiers. They were dragging it with both hands. hauling it with ropes and pushing it with their shoulders, for the slope rising from the plain to the terrace, although extremely gentle, was found impracticable for machines of such prodigious weight. However, it had 8 wheels banded with iron, and it had been advancing slowly in this way since the morning, like a mountain raised upon another. Then there appeared an immense ram issuing from its base. The doors along the 3 fronts which faced the town fell down, and cuirassed soldiers appeared in the interior like pillars of iron. Some might be seen climbing and descending the 2 staircases which crossed the stories. Some were waiting to dart out as soon as the cramps of the doors touched the walls. In the middle of the upper platform, the skeins of the ballistas were turning, and the great beam of the catapult was being lowered. Hamilcar was at that moment standing upright on the roof of Melkarth. He had calculated that it would come directly towards him, against what was the most invulnerable place in the wall, which was for that very reason denuded of sentries. His slaves had for a long time been bringing leathern bottles along the round way, where they had raised with clay 2 transverse partitions, forming a sort of basin. The water was flowing insensibly along the terrace, and, strange to say, it seemed to cause Hamilcar no anxiety. But when the helepolis was 30 paces off, he commanded planks to be placed over the streets between the houses from the cisterns to the rampart, and a file of people passed from hand to hand, helmets and amphoras, which were emptied continually. The Carthaginians, however, grew indignant at this waste of water. The ram was demolishing the wall, when suddenly a fountain sprang forth from the disjointed stones. Then the lofty brazen mass, 9 stories high, which contained and engaged more than 3,000 soldiers, began to rock gently like a ship. In fact, the water, which had penetrated the terrace, had broken up the path before it, wheels struck in the mire, the head of Spendius, with distended cheeks blowing an ivory cornet, appeared between leathern curtains on the 1st story. The great machine, as though convulsively upheaved, advanced perhaps 10 paces, but the ground softened more and more, the mire reached to the axles, and the helepolis stopped, leaning over frightfully to one side. The catapult rolled to the edge of the platform, and, carried away by the weight of its beam, fell, shattering the lower stories beneath it. The soldiers who were standing on the doors slipped into the abyss, or else held on to the extremities of the long beams, and by their weight increased the inclination of the helepolis, which was going to pieces with creakings in all its joints. The other barbarians rushed up to help them, massing themselves into a compact crowd. The Carthaginians descended from the rampart, and assailing them in the rear, killed them at leisure. But the chariots furnished with sickles hastened up, and galloped round the outskirts of the multitude. The latter ascended the wall again, night came on, and the barbarians gradually retired. Nothing could now be seen on the plain but a sort of perfectly blank, swarming mass, which extended from the bluish gulf to the purely white lagoon, and the lake, which had received streams of blood, stretched further away like a great purple pool. The terrace was now so laden with corpses that it looked as though it had been constructed of human bodies. In the centre stood the helepolis covered with armour, and from time to time huge fragments broke off from it, like stones from a crumbling pyramid. Broad tracks made by the streams of lead might be distinguished on the walls. A broken-down wooden tower burned here and there, and the houses showed dimly like the stages of a ruined amphitheatre. Heavy fumes of smoke were rising, and rolling with them sparks which were lost in the dark sky. The Carthaginians, however, who were consumed by thirst, had rushed to the cisterns. They broke open the doors. A miry swamp stretched at the bottom. What was to be done now? Moreover, the barbarians were countless, and when their fatigue was over, they would begin again. The people deliberated all night in groups at the corners of the streets. Some said that they ought to send away the women, the sick, and the old men. Others proposed to abandon the town and found a colony far away. But vessels were lacking, and when the sun appeared no decision had been made. There was no fighting that day, all being too much exhausted. The sleepers looked like corpses. When the Carthaginians, reflecting upon the cause of their disasters, remembered that they had not dispatched to Phoenicia the annual offering due to Tyrian Melkarth, and a great terror came upon them. The gods were indignant with the Republic, and were no doubt about to prosecute their vengeance. They were considered as cruel masters, who were appeased with supplications and allowed themselves to be bribed with presents. All were feeble in comparison with Moloch the Devourer. The existence, the very flesh of men, belonged to him, and hence, in order to preserve it, the Carthaginians used to offer up a portion of it to him, which calmed his fury. Children were burnt on the forehead, or on the nape of the neck, with woolen wicks, and as this mode of satisfying Baal brought in much money to the priests, they failed not to recommend it as being easier and more pleasant. This time, however, the Republic itself was at stake. But as every profit must be purchased by some loss, and as every transaction was regulated according to the needs of the weaker and the demands of the stronger, there was no pain great enough for the god, since he delighted in such as was of the most horrible description, and all were now at his mercy. He must accordingly be fully gratified. Precedents showed that in this way the scourge would be made to disappear. Moreover, it was believed that an immolation by fire would purify Carthage. The ferocity of the people was predisposed towards it. The choice, too, must fall exclusively upon the families of the great. The ancients assembled. The sitting was a long one. Hanno had come to it. As he was now unable to sit, he remained lying down near the door, half hidden among the fringes of the lofty tapestry, and when the pontiff of Moloch asked them whether they would consent to surrender their children, his voice suddenly broke forth from the shadow like the roaring of a genius in the depths of a cavern. He regretted, he said, that he had none of his own blood to give, and he gazed at Hamilcar, who faced him at the other end of the hall. The Suffet was so much disconcerted by this look that it made him lower his eyes. All successively bent their heads in approval, and in accordance with the rites, he had to reply to the high priest, "Yes, be it so." Then the ancients decreed the sacrifice in traditional circumlocution, because there are things more troublesome to say than to perform. The decision was almost immediately known in Carthage, and lamentations resounded. The cries of women might everywhere be heard. Their husbands consoled them, or railed at them with remonstrances. But 3 hours afterwards, extraordinary tidings were spread abroad. The Suffet had discovered springs at the foot of the cliff. There was a rush to the place. Water might be seen in holes dug in the sand, and some were already lying flat on the ground and drinking. Hamilcar did not himself know whether it was by the determination of the gods, or through the vague recollection of a revelation which his father had once made to him, but on leaving the ancients, he had gone down to the shore and had begun to dig the gravel with his slaves. He gave clothing, boots, and wine. He gave all the rest of the corn he was keeping by him. He even let the crowd enter his palace, and he opened kitchens, stores, and all the rooms, Salammbô's alone excepted. He announced that 6,000 Gaulish mercenaries were coming, and that the king of Macedonia was sending soldiers. But on the 2nd day the springs diminished, and on the evening of the 3rd they were completely dried up. Then the decree of the ancients passed everywhere from lip to lip, and the priests of Moloch began their task. Men in black robes presented themselves in the houses. In many instances the owners had deserted them under pretence of some business or of some dainty that they were going to buy, and the servants of Moloch came and took the children away. Others themselves surrendered them stupidly. Then they brought to the temple of Tanith, where the priestesses were charged with their amusement and support until the solemn day. They visited Hamilcar suddenly and found him in his gardens. "Barca, we come for that you know of, your son." They added that some people had met him one evening during the previous moon in the centre of the Mappalian district, being led by an old man. He was as though suffocated at first, but speedily understanding that any denial would be in vain, Hamilcar bowed, and he brought them into the commercial house. Some slaves who had run up at a sign kept watch all round about it. He entered Salammbô's room in a state of distraction. He seized Hannibal with one hand, snatched up the cord of a trailing garment with the other, tied his feet and hands with it, thrust the end into his mouth to form a gag, and hid him under the bed of the ox-hides by letting an ample drapery fall to the ground. Afterwards he walked about from right to left, raised his arms, wheeled around, bit his lips. Then he stood still with staring eyelids and panted as though he were about to die. But then he clapped his hands 3 times. Giddenem appeared. "Listen," he said. "Go and take from among the slaves a male child from 8 to 9 years of age, with black hair and swelling forehead. Bring him here, make haste." Giddenem soon entered again, bringing forward a young boy. He was a miserable child, at once lean and bloated. His skin looked greyish, like the infected rag hanging to his sides. His head was sunk between his shoulders, and with the back of his hand he was rubbing his eyes, which were filled with flies. How could he ever be confounded with Hannibal? And there was no time to choose another. Hamilcar looked at Giddenem. He felt inclined to strangle him. "Begone!" he cried, and the master of the slaves fled. The misfortunes which he had so long dreaded was therefore come, and with extravagant efforts he strove to discover whether there was not some mode, some means to escape it. Abdalonim suddenly spoke from behind the door. The Suffet was being asked for. The servants of Moloch were growing impatient. Hamilcar repressed a cry as though a red-hot iron had burnt him, and he began anew to pace the room like one distraught. Then he sank down beside the balustrade, and with his elbows on his knees pressed his forehead into his shut fists. The porphyry basin still contained a little clear water for Salammbô's ablutions. In spite of his repugnance and all his pride, the Suffet dipped the child into it, and like a slave merchant, began to wash him and rub him with strigils and red earth. Then he took 2 purple squares from the receptacles round the wall, placed one on his breast and the other on his back, and joined them together on the collar bones with 2 diamond clasps. He poured perfume upon his head, passed an electrum necklace around his neck, and put on him sandals with heels of pearl, sandals belonging to his own daughter. But he stamped with shame and vexation. Salammbô, who busied herself in helping him, was as pale as he. The child, dazzled by such splendor, smiled and, growing bold even, was beginning to clap his hands and jump when Hamilcar took him away. He held him firmly by the arm as though he were afraid of losing him, and the child, who was hurt, wept a little as he ran beside him. When, on a level with the ergastulum, under a palm tree, a voice was raised, a mournful and supplicant voice. It murmured, "Master, O master!" Hamilcar turned, and beside him perceived a man of abject appearance, one of the wretches who led a haphazard existence in the household. "What do you want?" said the Suffet. The slave, who trembled horribly, stammered, "I am his father." Hamilcar walked on. The other followed him with stooping loins, bent hams, and head thrust forward. His face was convulsed with unspeakable anguish, and he was choking with suppressed sobs, so eager was he at once to question him and to cry, "Mercy!" At last he ventured to touch him lightly with one finger on the elbow. "Are you going to—" He had not the strength to finish, and Hamilcar stopped quite amazed at such grief. He had never thought, so immense was the abyss separating them from each other, that there could be anything in common between them. It even appeared to him a sort of outrage, an encroachment upon his own privileges. He replied with a look colder and heavier than an executioner's axe. The slave swooned and fell in the dust at his feet. Hamilcar strode across him. The 3 black-robed men were waiting in the great hall and standing against the stone disk. Immediately he tore his garments and rolled upon the pavement, uttering piercing cries. "Ah, poor little Hannibal! Oh, my son, my consolation, my hope, my life! Kill me also! Take me away! Woe! Woe!" He ploughed his face with his nails, tore out his hair, and shrieked like the women who lamented at funerals. "Take him away, then! My suffering is too great! Begone! Kill me like him!" The servants of Moloch were astonished that the great Hamilcar was so weak-spirited. They were almost moved by it. A noise of naked feet became audible, with a broken throat rattling like the breathing of a wild beast speeding along, and a man, pale, terrible, and with outspread arms, appeared on the threshold of the 3rd gallery, between the ivory pots. He exclaimed, "My child!" Hamilcar threw himself with a bound upon the slave, and covering the man's mouth with his hand exclaimed still more loudly, "It is the old man who reared him. He calls him my child. It will make him mad. Enough! Enough!" And hustling away the 3 priests and their victim, he went out with them and with a great kick shut the door behind them. Hamilcar strained his ears for some minutes in constant fear of seeing them return. He then thought of getting rid of the slave in order to be quite sure that he would see nothing, but the peril had not wholly disappeared, and if the gods were provoked at the man's death, it might be turned against his son. Then, changing his intention, he sent him by Tanach the best from his kitchens, a quarter of a goat, beans, and preserved pomegranates. The slave, who had eaten nothing for a long time, rushed upon them, his tears fell into the dishes. Hamilcar at last returned to Salammbô and unfastened Hannibal's cords. The child in exasperation bit his hand until the blood came. He repelled him with a caress. To make him remain quiet, Salammbô tried to frighten him with Lamia, a Cyrenian ogress. "But where is she?" he asked. He was told that brigands were coming to put him into prison. "Let them come," he rejoined, "and I will kill them." Then Hamilcar told him the frightful truth, but he fell into a passion with his father, contending that he was quite able to annihilate the whole people, since he was the master of Carthage. At last, exhausted by his exertions and anger, he fell into a wild sleep. He spoke in his dreams, his back leaning against a scarlet cushion. His head was thrown back somewhat, and his little arm, outstretched from his body, lay quite straight in an attitude of command. When the night had grown dark, Hamilcar lifted him up gently, and without a torch went down the galley staircase. As he passed through the mercantile house, he took up a basket of grapes and a flagon of pure water. The child awoke before the statue of Aletes in the vault of gems, and he smiled, like the other, on his father's arm at the brilliant lights which surrounded him. Hamilcar felt quite sure that his son could not be taken from him. It was an impenetrable spot communicating with the beach by a subterranean passage which he alone knew, and casting his eyes around he inhaled a great draught of air. Then he sent him down upon a stool beside some golden shields. No one at present could see him. He had no further need for watching, and he relieved his feelings. Like a mother finding her firstborn that was lost, he threw himself upon his son. He clasped him to his breast. He laughed and wept at the same time. He called him by the fondest names and covered him with kisses. Little Hannibal was frightened by this terrible tenderness, and was silent now. End of chapter 13, part 3. Chapter 13, Part 4 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 13, Part 4. Hamilcar returned with silent steps, feeling the walls around him, and came into the great hall, where the moonlight entered through one of the apertures in the dome. In the centre the slave lay sleeping after his repast, stretched at full length upon the marble pavement. He looked at him and was moved with a sort of pity. With the tip of his cothurn he pushed forward a carpet beneath his head. Then he raised his eyes and gazed at Tanith, whose slender crescent was shining in the sky, and felt himself stronger than the Baals and full of contempt for them. The arrangements for the sacrifice were already begun. Part of a wall in the temple of Moloch was thrown down in order to draw out the brazen god without touching the ashes of the altar. Then, as soon as the sun appeared, the hierodules pushed it towards the square of Khamon. It moved backwards, sliding upon cylinders. Its shoulders overlapped the walls. No sooner did the Carthaginians perceive it in the distance than they speedily took to flight, for the Baal could be looked upon with impunity only when exercising his wrath. A smell of aromatics spread through the streets. All the temples had just been opened simultaneously, and from them there came forth tabernacles borne upon chariots, or upon litters carried by the pontiffs. Great plumes swayed at the corners of them, and rays were emitted from their slender pinnacles, which terminated in balls of crystal, gold, silver, or copper. These were the Canaanitish Baalim, offshoots of the supreme Baal, who were returning to their first cause to humble themselves before his might and annihilate themselves in his splendor. Melkarth's pavilion, which was of fine purple, sheltered a petroleum flare. On Khamon's, which was of hyacinth colour, there rose an ivory phallus bordered with a circle of gems. Between Eskmound's curtains, which were as blue as the ether, a sleeping python formed a circle with his tail, and the Pataic gods, held in the arms of their priests, looked like great infants in swaddling clothes, with their heels touching the ground. Then came all the inferior forms of the divinity: Baal Samin, god of celestial space; Baal Peor, god of the sacred mountains; Baal Zebub, god of corruption, with those of the neighboring countries and congenerous races; the Iarbal of Libya, the Adramelech of Chaldea, the Kijun of the Syrians; Derceto, with her virgin's face, crept on her fins, and the corpse of Tammuz was drawn along in the midst of a catafalque among torches and heads of hair. In order to subdue the kings of the firmament to the sun, and prevent their particular influences from disturbing his, diversely coloured metal stars were brandished at the end of long poles, and all were there, from the dark Neblo, the genius of Mercury, to the hideous Rahab, which is the constellation of the crocodile. The abadirs, stones which had fallen from the moon, were whirling in slings of silver thread. Little loaves representing the female form were borne on baskets by the priests of Ceres. Others brought their fetishes and amulets. Forgotten idols appeared, while the mystic symbols had been taken from the very ships, as though Carthage wished to concentrate herself wholly upon a single thought of death and desolation. Before each tabernacle a man balanced a large vase of smoking incense on his head. Clouds hovered here and there, and the hangings, pendants, and embroideries of the sacred pavilions might be distinguished amid the thick vapours. These advanced slowly, owing to their enormous weight. Sometimes the axles became fast in the street, then the pious took advantage of the opportunity to touch the Baalim with their garments, which they preserved afterwards as holy things. The brazen statue continued to advance towards the square of Khamon. The rich, carrying sceptres with emerald balls, set out from the bottom of Megara. The ancients, with diadems on their heads, had assembled in Kinisdo, and masters of the finances, governors of provinces, sailors, and the numerous horde employed at funerals, all with the insignia of their magistracies, or the instruments of their calling, were making their way towards the tabernacles, which were descending from the Acropolis between the colleges of the pontiffs. Out of deference to Moloch, they had adorned themselves with the most splendid jewels. Diamonds sparkled on their black garments, but their rings were too large and fell from their wasted hands. Nor could there have been anything so mournful as this silent crowd where earrings tapped against pale faces, and gold tiaras clasped brows contracted with stern despair. At last the Baal arrived exactly in the centre of the square. His pontiffs arranged an enclosure with trellis work to keep off the multitude, and remained around him at his feet. The priests of Khamon, in tawny woolen robes, formed a line before their temple beneath the columns of the portico. Those of Eskmoun, in linen mantles with necklaces of Kokufas heads and pointed tiaras, posted themselves on the steps of the Acropolis. The priests of Melkarth, in violet tunics, took the western side. The priests of the Abbadirs, clasped with bands of Phrygian stuffs, placed themselves on the east, while towards the south, with the necromancers all covered with tattooings, and the shriekers in patched cloaks, were ranged the curates of the Pataic guards, and the Yidonim, who put the bone of a dead man into their mouths to learn the future. The priests of Ceres, who were dressed in blue robes, had prudently stopped in the street of Sartheb, and in low tones were chanting a Thesmophorion in the Megarian dialect. From time to time files of men arrived, completely naked, their arms outstretched, and all holding one another by the shoulders. From the depths of their breasts they drew forth a hoarse and cavernous intonation. Their eyes, which were fastened upon the colossus, shone through the dust, and they swayed their bodies simultaneously, and at equal distances, as though they were all affected by a single movement. They were so frenzied that to restore order the hierodules compelled them, with blows of the stick, to lie flat upon the ground, with their faces resting against the brass trellis work. Then it was that a man in a white robe advanced from the back of the square. He penetrated the crowd slowly, and people recognized the priest of Tanith, the high priest Shahabarim. Hootings were raised, for the tyranny of the male principle prevailed that day in all consciences, and the goddess was actually so completely forgotten that the absence of her pontiffs had not been noticed. But the amazement was increased when he was seen to open one of the doors of the trellis work intended for those who intended to offer up victims. It was an outrage to their god, thought the priests of Moloch, that he had just committed, and they sought with eager gestures to repel him. Fed on the meat of the holocausts, clad in purple like kings, and wearing triple-storied crowns, they despised the pale eunuch, weakened with his macerations, and angry laughter shook their black beards, which were displayed on their breasts in the sun. Shahabarim walked on, giving no reply, and traversing the whole enclosure with deliberation, reached the legs of the colossus. Then, spreading out both arms, he touched it on both sides, which was a solemn form of adoration. For a long time rabbits had been torturing him, and in despair, or perhaps for lack of a god that completely satisfied his ideas, he had at last decided for this one. The crowd, terrified by this act of apostasy, uttered a lengthened murmur. It was felt that the last tie which bound their souls to a merciful divinity was breaking. But, owing to his mutilation, Shahabarim could take no part in the cult of the Baal. The men in the red cloaks shut him out from the enclosure. Then, when he was outside, he went around all the colleges in succession, and the priest, henceforth without a guard, disappeared into the crowd. It scattered at his approach. Meanwhile, a fire of aloes, cedar, and laurel was burning between the legs of the colossus. The tips of its long wings dipped into the flame. The unguents with which it had been rubbed flowed like sweat over its brazen limbs. Around the circular flagstone on which its feet rested, the children, wrapped in black veils, formed a motionless circle, and its extravagantly long arms reached down their palms to them as though to seize the crown that they formed and carry it to the sky. The rich, the ancients, the women, the whole multitude thronged behind the priests and on the terraces of the houses. The large painted stars revolved no longer. The tabernacles were set upon the ground, and the fumes from the censers ascended perpendicularly, spreading their bluish branches through the azure like gigantic trees. Many fainted, others became inert and petrified in their ecstasy. Infinite anguish weighed upon the breasts of the beholders. The last shouts died out one by one, and the people of Carthage stood breathless and absorbed in the longing of their terror. At last the high priest of Moloch passed his left hand beneath the children's veils, plucked a lock of hair from their foreheads, and threw it upon the flames. Then the men in their red cloaks chanted the sacred hymn. Homage to thee, Sun, King of the two zones, self-generating creator, father and mother, father and son, god and goddess, goddess and god. And their voices were lost in the outburst of instruments, sounding simultaneously to drown the cries of the victims. The 8-stringed skiminiths, the kinnors which had 10 strings, and the nebals which had 12, grated, whistled, and thundered. Enormous leathern bags, bristling with pipes, made a shrill clashing noise. The tabourines, beaten with all the players' might, resounded with heavy, rapid blows, and in spite of the fury of the clarions, the salsalim snapped like grasshoppers' wings. The hierodules, with a long hook, opened the 7-storied compartments on the body of the Baal. They put meal into the highest, 2 turtle doves in the second, an ape into the third, a ram into the fourth, a sheep into the fifth, and as no ox was to be had for the 6th, a tawny hide taken from the sanctuary was thrown into it. The 7th compartment yawned empty still. Before undertaking anything, it was well to make trial of the arms of the god. Slender chainlets stretched from its fingers up to his shoulders and fell behind, where men, by pulling them, made the 2 hands rise to a level with the elbows, and come closer together against the belly. They were moved several times in succession with little abrupt jerks. Then the instruments were still. The fire roared. The pontiffs of Moloch walked about on the great flagstone, scanning the multitude. An individual sacrifice was necessary, a perfectly voluntary oblation, which was considered as carrying the others along with it. But no one had appeared up to the present, and the 7 passages leading from the barriers to the colossus were completely empty. Then the priests, to encourage the people, drew bodkins from their girdles and gashed their faces. The devotees, who were stretched on the ground outside, were brought within the enclosure. A bundle of horrible irons was thrown to them, and each chose his own torture. They drove in spits between their breasts, they split their cheeks, they put crowns of thorns upon their heads, then they twined their arms together and surrounded the children in another large circle, which widened and contracted in turns. They reached to the balustrade, they threw themselves back again, and then began once more, attracting the crowd to them by the dizziness of their motion, with its accompanying blood and shrieks. By degrees people came into the end of the passages. They flung into the flames pearls, gold vases, cups, torches, all their wealth. The offerings became constantly more numerous and more splendid. At last, a man who tottered, a man pale and hideous with terror, thrust forward a child. Then a little black mass was seen between the hands of the colossus, and sank into the dark opening. The priests bent over the edge of the great flagstone, and a new song burst forth celebrating the joys of death and of new birth into eternity. The children ascended slowly, and as the smoke formed lofty eddies as it escaped, they seemed at a distance to disappear into a cloud. No one stirred. Their wrists and ankles were tied, and the dark drapery prevented them from seeing anything and from being recognized. Hamilcar, in a red cloak, like the priests of Moloch, was beside the Baal, standing upright in front of the great toe of its right foot. When the 14th child was brought, everyone could see him make a great gesture of horror, but he soon resumed his former attitude, folded his arms and looked upon the ground. The high pontiff stood on the other side of the statue, as motionless as he. His head, laden with an Assyrian mitre, was bent, and he was watching the gold plate on his breast. It was covered with fatidical stones, and the flame mirrored in it formed irisated lights. He grew pale and dismayed. Hamilcar bent his brow, and they were both so near the funeral pile that the hems of their cloaks brushed it as they rose from time to time. The brazen arms were working more quickly. They paused no longer. Every time that a child was placed in them, the priests of Moloch spread out their hands upon him to burden him with the crimes of the people, vociferating, "They are not men, but oxen," and the multitude round about repeated, "Oxen, oxen." The devout exclaimed, "Lord, eat," and the priests of Proserpine, complying through terror with the needs of Carthage, muttered the Eleusinian formula, "Pour out rain, bring forth." The victims, when scarcely at the edge of the opening, disappeared like a drop of water on a red-hot plate, and white smoke rose amid the great scarlet colour. Nevertheless, the appetite of the god was not appeased. He ever wished for more. In order to furnish him with a larger supply, the victims were piled up on his hands with a big chain above them, which kept them in their place. Some devout persons had at the beginning wished to count them, to see whether their number corresponded with the days of the solar year, but others were brought, and it was impossible to distinguish them in the giddy motion of the horrible arms. This lasted for a long, indefinite time, until the evening. Then the partitions inside assumed a darker glow, and burning flesh could be seen. Some even believed that they could descry hair, limbs, and whole bodies. Night fell. Clouds accumulated above the Baal. The funeral pile, which was flameless now, formed a pyramid of coals up to his knees. Completely red like a giant covered with blood, he looked, with his head thrown back, as though he were staggering beneath the weight of his intoxication. In proportion as the priests made haste, the frenzy of the people increased. As the number of the victims was diminishing, some cried out to spare them, others that still more were needful. The walls, with their burden of people, seemed to be giving way beneath the howlings of terror and mystic voluptuousness. Then the faithful came into the passages, dragging their children, who clung to them, and they beat them in order to make them let go, and handed them over to the men in red. The instrument players sometimes stopped through exhaustion. Then the cries of the mothers might be heard, and the frizzling of the fat as it fell upon the coals. The henbane drinkers crawled on all fours around the colossus, roaring like tigers. The Yedonim vaticinated, the devotees sang with their cloven lips, the trellis work had been broken through, all wished for a share in the sacrifice, and fathers, whose children had died previously, cast their effigies, their playthings, their preserved bones into the fire. Some who had knives rushed upon the rest. They slaughtered one another. The hierodules took the fallen ashes at the edge of the flagstone in bronze fans, and cast them into the air, that the sacrifice might be scattered over the town, and even to the region of the stars. The loud noise and great light had attracted the barbarians to the foot of the walls. They clung to the wreck of the Helepolis to have a better view, and gazed open-mouthed in horror. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14, Part 1 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 14, Part 1. The Pass of the Hatchet. The Carthaginians had not re-entered their houses when the clouds accumulated more thickly. Those who raised their heads towards the colossus could feel big drops on their foreheads, and the rain fell. It fell the whole night plentifully, in floods. The thunder growled. It was the voice of Moloch. He had vanquished Tanith, and she, being now fecundated, opened up her vast bosom in heaven's heights. Sometimes she could be seen in a clear and luminous spot, stretched upon cushions of cloud, and then the darkness would close in again, as though she were still too weary and wished to sleep again. The Carthaginians, all believing that water is brought forth by the moon, shouted to make her travail easy. The rain beat upon the terraces and overflowed them, forming lakes in the courts, cascades on the staircases, and eddies at the corners of the streets. It poured in warm, heavy masses and urgent streams. Big, frothy jets leaped from the corners of all the buildings, and it seemed as though whitish cloths hung dimly upon the walls, and the washed temple roofs shone black in the gleam of the lightning. Torrents descended from the Acropolis by 1,000 paths. Houses suddenly gave way, and small beams, plaster, rubbish, and furniture passed along in streams which ran impetuously over the pavement. Amphoras, flagons, and canvases had been placed out of doors, but the torches were extinguished, brands were taken from the funeral pile of the Baal, and the Carthaginians bent back their necks and opened their mouths to drink. Others, by the side of the miry pools, plunged their arms into them up to the armpits, and filled themselves so abundantly with water that they vomited it forth like buffaloes. The freshness gradually spread, they breathed in the damp air with play of limb, and in the happiness of their intoxication boundless hope soon arose. All their miseries were forgotten, their country was born anew. They felt the need, as it were, of directing upon others the extravagant fury which they had been unable to employ against themselves. Such a sacrifice could not be in vain. Although they felt no remorse, they found themselves carried away by the frenzy which results from complicity in irreparable crimes. The barbarians had encountered the storm in their ill-closed tents, and they were still quite chilled on the morrow as they tramped through the mud in search of their stores and weapons, which were spoiled and lost. Hamilcar went himself to see Hanno, and in spite of his plenary powers, entrusted the command to him. The old Suffet hesitated for a few minutes between his animosity and his appetite for authority, but he accepted nevertheless. Hamilcar next took out a galley armed with a catapult at each end. He placed it in the gulf in front of the raft, then he embarked his stoutest troops on board such vessels as were available. He was apparently taking to flight, and running northward before the wind he disappeared into the mist. But 3 days afterwards, when the attack was about to begin again, some people arrived tumultuously from the Libyan coast. Barca had come among them, he had carried off provisions everywhere, and he was spreading through the country. Then the barbarians were indignant as though he were betraying them. Those who were most weary of the siege, and especially the Gauls, did not hesitate to leave the walls in order to try and rejoin him. Spendius wanted to reconstruct the Hellepolis. Matho had traced an imaginary line from his tent to Megara, and inwardly swore to follow it, and none of their men stirred. But the rest, under the command of Autaritus, went off, abandoning the western part of the rampart, and so profound was the carelessness exhibited that no one even thought of replacing them. Narr'Havas spied them from afar in the mountains. During the night he led all his men along the seashore on the outer side of the lagoon, and entered Carthage. He presented himself as a saviour with 6,000 men, all carrying meal under their cloaks, and 40 elephants laden with forage and dried meat. The people flocked quickly around them. They gave them names. The sight of these strong animals, sacred to Baal, gave the Carthaginians even more joy than the arrival of such relief. It was a token of the tenderness of the god, a proof that he was at last about to interfere in the war to defend them. Narr'Havas received the compliments of the ancients. Then he ascended to Salammbô's palace. He had not seen her again since the time when in Hamilcar's tent amid the 5 armies he had felt her little, cold, soft hand fastened to his own. She had left for Carthage after the betrothal. His love, which had been diverted by other ambitions, had come back to him, and now he expected to enjoy his rights, to marry her and take her. Salammbô did not understand how the young man could ever become her master. Although she asked Tanith every day for Matho's death, her horror of the Libyan was growing less. She vaguely felt that the hate with which he had persecuted her was something almost religious, and she would fain have seen in Narr'Havas's person a reflection, as it were, of that malice which still dazzled her. She desired to know him better, and yet his presence would have embarrassed her. She sent him word that she could not receive him. Moreover, Hamilcar had forbidden his people to admit the king of the Numidians to see her. By putting off his reward to the end of the war he hoped to retain his devotion, and, through dread of the Suffet, Narr'Havas withdrew. But he bore himself haughtily towards the 100. He changed their arrangements. He demanded privileges for his men, and placed them on important posts. Thus the barbarians stared when they perceived Numidians on the towers. The surprise of the Carthaginians was greater still when 300 of their own people, who had been made prisoners during the Sicilian War, arrived on board an old Punic trireme. Hamilcar, in fact, had secretly sent back to the Creretes the crews of the Latin vessels taken before the defection of the Tyrian towns, and, to reciprocate the courtesy, Rome was now sending him back her captives. She scorned the overtures of the mercenaries in Sardinian, and would not even recognize the inhabitants of Utica as subjects. Hiero, who was ruling at Syracuse, was carried away by his example. For the preservation of his own states it was necessary that an equilibrium should exist between the two peoples. He was interested, therefore, in the safety of the Canaanites, and he declared himself their friend, and sent them 1,200 oxen with 53,000 nebels of pure wheat. A deeper reason prompted aid to Carthage. It was felt that if the mercenaries triumphed, everyone, from soldier to plate washer, would rise, and that no government and no house could resist them. Meanwhile, Hamilcar was scouring the eastern districts. He drove back the Gauls, and all the barbarians found that they were themselves in something like a state of siege. Then he set himself to harass them. He would arrive and then retire, and by constantly renewing his maneuver, he gradually detached them from their encampments. Spendius was obliged to follow them, and in the end Matho yielded in like manner. He did not pass beyond Tunis. He shut himself up within its walls. This persistence was full of wisdom, for soon Narr'Havas was to be seen issuing from the gate of Khamon with his elephants and soldiers. Hamilcar was recalling him, but the other barbarians were already wandering about in the provinces in pursuit of the Suffet. The latter had received 3,000 Gauls from Clypea. He had horses brought to him from Cyrenaica, and armour from Brutium, and began the war again. Never had his genius been so impetuous and fertile. For 5 moons he dragged his enemies after him. He had an end to which he wished to guide them. The barbarians had at first tried to encompass him with small detachments, but he always escaped them. They ceased to separate then. Their army amounted to about 40,000 men, and several times they enjoyed the sight of seeing the Carthaginians fall back. The horsemen of Narr'Havas were what they found most tormenting. Often, at times of the greatest weariness, when they were advancing over the plains and dozing beneath the weight of their arms, a great line of dust would suddenly rise on the horizon. There would be a galloping up to them, and a rain of darts would pour from the bosom of a cloud filled with flaming eyes. The Numidians in their white cloaks would utter loud shouts, raise their arms, press their rearing stallions with their knees, and wheeling them around abruptly, would then disappear. They had always supplies of javelins and dromedaries some distance off, and they would return more terrible than before, howl like wolves, and take to flight like vultures. The barbarians posted at the extremities of the files fell one by one, and this would continue until evening, when an attempt would be made to enter the mountains. Although they were perilous for elephants, Hamilcar made his way in among them. He followed the chain which extends from the promontory of Hermaeum to the top of Zaguan. This, they believed, was a device for hiding the insufficiency of his troops, but the continual uncertainty in which he kept them exasperated them at last more than any defeat. They did not lose heart, and marched after him. At last, one evening, they surprised a body of Velites amid some big rocks at the entrance of a pass between the Silver Mountain and the Lead Mountain. The entire army was certainly in front of them, for a noise of footsteps and clarions could be heard. The Carthaginians immediately fled through the gorge. It descended into a plain, and was shaped like an iron hatchet with a surrounding of lofty cliffs. The barbarians dashed into it in order to overtake the Velites. Quite at the bottom, other Carthaginians were running tumultuously amid galloping oxen. A man in a red cloak was to be seen. It was the Suffet. They shouted this to one another, and they were carried away with increased fury and joy. Several, from laziness or prudence, had remained on the threshold of the pass, but some cavalry, debouching from a wood, beat them down upon the rest with blows of pike and sabre, and soon all the barbarians were below in the plain. Then this great human mass, after swaying to and fro for some time, stood still. They could discover no outlet. Those who were nearest to the pass went back again, but the passage had entirely disappeared. They hailed those in front to make them go on. They were being crushed against the mountain, and from a distance they inveighed against their companions, who were unable to find the route again. In fact, the barbarians had scarcely descended when men who had been crouching behind the rocks raised the latter with beams and overthrew them, and as the slope was steep, the huge blocks had rolled down pell-mell and completely stopped up the narrow opening. At the other extremity of the plain stretched a long passage, split in gaps here and there, and leading to a ravine which ascended to the upper plateau, where the Punic army was stationed. Ladders had been placed beforehand in this passage against the wall of cliff, and, protected by the windings of the gaps, the Velites were able to seize and mount them before being overtaken. Several even made their way to the bottom of the ravine. They were drawn up with cables, for the ground at this spot was of moving sand, and so much inclined that it was impossible to climb it even to the knees. The barbarians arrived almost immediately, but a portcullis 40 cubits high and made to fit the intervening space exactly, suddenly sank before them like a rampart fallen from the skies. The Suffet's combinations had therefore succeeded. None of the mercenaries knew the mountain, and marching as they did at the head of the columns, they had drawn on the rest. The rocks, which were somewhat narrow at the base, had been easily cast down, and while all were running, his army had raised shouts as of distress on the horizon. Hamilcar, it is true, might have lost his velites, only half of whom remained, but he would have sacrificed 20 times as many for the success of such an enterprise. The barbarians pressed forward until morning in compact files from one end of the plain to the other. They felt the mountain with their hands, seeking to discover a passage. At last day broke, and they perceived all about them a great white wall hewn with the pick, and no means of safety, no hope. The two natural outcomes from this blind alley were closed by the portcullis and the heaps of rock. Then they all looked at one another without speaking. They sank down in collapse, feeling an icy coldness in their loins and an overwhelming weight upon their eyelids. They rose and bounded against the rocks, but the lowest were weighted by the pressure of the others and were immovable. They tried to cling to them so as to reach the top, but the bellying shape of the great masses rendered all hold impossible. They sought to cleave the ground on both sides of the gorge, but their instruments broke. They made a large fire with the tent poles, but the fire could not burn the mountain. They returned to the portcullis. It was garnished with long nails as thick as stakes, as sharp as the spines of a porcupine, and closer than the hairs of a brush. But they were animated by such rage that they dashed themselves against it. The first were pierced to the backbone, those coming next surged over them, and all fell back, leaving human fragments and blood-stained hair on those horrible branches. When their discouragement was somewhat abated, they made an examination of the provisions. The mercenaries, whose baggage was lost, possessed scarcely enough for 2 days, and all the rest found themselves destitute, for they had been awaiting a convoy promised by the villages of the south. However, some bulls were roaming about, those which the Carthaginians had loosened in the gorge to attract the barbarians. They killed them with lance thrust and ate them, and when their stomachs were filled, their thoughts were less mournful. The next day they slaughtered all the mules to the number of about 40, then they scraped the skins, boiled the entrails, pounded the bones, and did not yet despair. The army from Tunis had no doubt been warned, and was coming. But on the evening of the 5th day their hunger increased. They gnawed their sword belts and the little sponges which bordered the bottom of their helmets. These 40,000 men were massed into the species of hippodrome formed by the mountain about them. Some remained in front of the portcullis or at the foot of the rocks. The rest covered the plain confusedly. The strong shunned one another, and the timid sought out the brave, who nevertheless were unable to save them. To avoid infection, the corpse of the velites had been speedily buried, and the position of the graves was no longer visible. All the barbarians lay drooping on the ground. A veteran would pass between their lines here and there, and they would howl curses against the Carthaginians, against Hamilcar, and against Matho, although he was innocent of their disaster, but it seemed to them that their pains would have been less if he had shared them. Then they groaned, and some wept softly, like little children. They came to the captains and besought them to grant them something that would alleviate their sufferings. The others made no reply, or seized with fury, would pick up a stone and fling it in their faces. Several, in fact, carefully kept a reserve of food in a hole in the ground, a few handfuls of dates or a little meal, and they ate this during the night, with their heads bent beneath their cloaks. Those who had swords kept them naked in their hands, and the most suspicious remained standing with their backs against the mountain. They accused their chiefs and threatened them. Autaritus was not afraid of showing himself. With the barbaric obstinacy which nothing could discourage, he would advance 20 times a day to the rocks at the bottom, hoping every time to find them perchance displaced, and swaying his heavy fur-covered shoulders, he reminded his companions of a bear coming forth from its cave in springtime to see whether the snows are melted. Spendius, surrounded by the Greeks, hid himself in one of the gaps. As he was afraid, he caused a rumour of his death to be spread. They were now hideously lean, their skin was overlaid with bluish marblings. On the evening of the 9th day, 3 Iberians died. Their frightened companions left the spot. They were stripped, and the white, naked bodies lay in the sunshine on the sand. Then the Garamantians began to prowl slowly round about them. They were men accustomed to existence in solitude, and they reverenced no god. At last the oldest of the band made a sign, and bending over the corpses, they cut strips from them with their knives, then squatted upon their heels and ate. The rest looked on from a distance. They uttered cries of horror, many nevertheless being, at the bottom of their souls, jealous of such courage. In the middle of the night some of these approached, and dissembling their eagerness, asked for a small mouthful, merely to try, they said. Bolder ones came up, their number increased, there was soon a crowd, but almost all of them let their hands fall on feeling the cold flesh on the edge of their lips. Others, on the contrary, devoured it with delight. That they might be led away by example, they urged one another on mutually. Such as had first refused went to see the Garamantians, and returned no more. They cooked the pieces on coals at the point of the sword, they salted them with dust, and contended for the best morsels. When nothing was left of the 3 corpses, their eyes ranged over the whole plain to find others. But were they not in possession of Carthaginians? 20 captives, taken in the last encounter, whom no one had noticed up to the present. These disappeared. Moreover, it was an act of vengeance. Then, as they must live, as the taste for this food had become developed, and as they were dying, they cut the throats of the water-carriers, grooms, and all the serving men belonging to the mercenaries. They killed some of them every day. Some ate much, recovered strength, and were sad no more. Soon this resource failed. Then the longing was directed to the wounded and sick. Since they could not recover, it was as well to release them from their tortures, and as soon as a man began to stagger, all exclaimed that he was now lost, and ought to be made use of for the rest. Artifices were employed to accelerate their death. The last remnant of their foul portion was stolen from them. They were trodden on as though by inadvertence. Those in the last throes, wishing to make believe that they were strong, strove to stretch out their arms, to rise, to laugh. Men who had swooned came to themselves at the touch of a notched blade sawing off a limb, and they still slew, ferociously and needlessly, to sate their fury. End of chapter 14, part 1. Chapter 14, part 2 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 14, part 2. A mist, heavy and warm, such as comes in those regions at the end of winter, sank on the 14th day upon the army. This change of temperature brought numerous deaths with it, and corruption was developed with frightful rapidity in the warm dampness which was kept in by the sides of the mountain. The drizzle that fell upon the corpses softened them, and soon made the plain one broad tract of rottenness. Whitish vapours floated overhead. They pricked the nostrils, penetrated the skin, and troubled the sight. And the barbarians thought that through the exhalations of the breath they could see the souls of their companions. They were overwhelmed with immense disgust. They wished for nothing more. They preferred to die. 2 days afterwards the weather became fine again, and hunger seized them once more. It seemed to them that their stomachs were being wrenched from them with tongs. Then they rolled about in convulsions, flung handfuls of dust into their mouths, bit their arms, and burst into frantic laughter. They were still more tormented by thirst, for they had not a drop of water, the leathern bottles having been completely dried up since the 9th day. To cheat their need, they applied their tongues to the metal plates on their waist belts, their ivory pommels, and the steel of their swords. Some former caravan leaders tightened their waists with ropes. Others sucked a pebble. They drank urine cooled in their brazen helmets. And they still expected the army from Tunis. The length of time which it took in coming was, according to their conjectures, an assurance of its early arrival. Besides, Matho, who was a brave fellow, would not desert them. "'Twill be tomorrow," they would say to one another, and then tomorrow would pass. At the beginning they had offered up prayers and vows, and practised all kinds of incantations. Just now their only feeding on their divinities was one of hatred, and they strove to revenge themselves by believing in them no more. Men of violent disposition perished first. The Africans held out better than the Gauls. Zarxus lay stretched at full length among the Balearians, his hair over his arm, inert. Spendius found a plant with broad leaves filled abundantly with juice, and after declaring that it was poisonous, so as to keep off the rest, he fed himself upon it. They were too weak to knock down the flying crows with stones. Sometimes, when a Gypaetus was perched on a corpse, and had been mangling it for a long time, a man would set himself to crawl towards it with a javelin between his teeth. He would support himself with one hand, and after taking a good aim, throw his weapon. The white-feathered creature, disturbed by the noise, would desist and look about in tranquil fashion, like a cormorant on a rock, and would then again thrust in its hideous yellow beak, while the man, in despair, would fall flat on his face in the dust. Some succeeded in discovering chameleons and serpents, but it was the love of life that kept them alive. They directed their souls to this idea exclusively, and clung to existence by an effort of the will that prolonged it. The most stoical kept close to one another, seated in a circle here and there, among the dead in the middle of the plain, and wrapped in their cloaks they gave themselves up silently to their sadness. Those who had been born in towns recalled the resounding streets, the taverns, theatres, baths, and the barbers' shops, where there are tales to be heard. Others could once more see country districts at sunset, when the yellow corn waves, and the great oxen ascend the hills again with the ploughshares on their necks. Travellers dreamt of cisterns, hunters of their forests, veterans of battles, and in the somnolence that benumbed them, their thoughts jostled one another with the precipitancy and clearness of dreams. Hallucinations came suddenly upon them. They sought for a door in the mountain in order to flee, and tried to pass through it. Others thought that they were sailing in a storm, and gave orders for the handling of a ship, or else fell back in terror, perceiving Punic battalions in the clouds. There were some who imagined themselves at a feast and sang. Many, through a strange mania, would repeat the same word, or continually make the same gesture. Then, when they happened to raise their heads and look at one another, they were choked with sobs on discovering the horrible ravages made in their faces. Some had ceased to suffer, and to while away the hours, told of the perils which they had escaped. Death was certain and imminent to all. How many times had they not tried to open up a passage? As to implore terms from the conqueror, by what means could they do so? They did not even know where Hamilcar was. The wind was blowing from the direction of the ravine. It made the sand flow perpetually in cascades over the portcullis, and the cloaks and hair of the barbarians were being covered with it, as though the earth were rising upon them, and desirous of burying them. Nothing stirred. The eternal mountain seemed still higher to them every morning. Sometimes flights of birds darted past beneath the blue sky in the freedom of the air. The men closed their eyes that they might not see them. At first they felt a buzzing in their ears. Their nails grew black, the cold reached to their breasts. They lay upon their sides and expired without a cry. On the 19th day, 2,000 Asiatics were dead, with 1,500 from the archipelago, 8,000 from Libya, the youngest of the mercenaries, and whole tribes, in all 20,000 soldiers, or half of the army. Auteritus, who had only 50 golds left, was going to kill himself in order to put an end to this state of things, when he thought he saw a man on the top of the mountain in front of him. Owing to his elevation, this man did not appear taller than a dwarf. However, Auteritus recognized a shield shaped like a trefoil on his left arm. "A Carthaginian!" he exclaimed, and immediately throughout the plain, before the portcullis and beneath the rocks, all rose. The soldier was walking along the edge of the precipice. The barbarians gazed at him from below. Spendius picked up the head of an ox. Then, having formed a diadem with 2 belts, he fixed it on the horns at the end of a pole in token of pacific intentions. The Carthaginian disappeared. They waited. At last in the evening a sword belt suddenly fell from above like a stone loosened from the cliff. It was made of red leather covered with embroidery, with 3 diamond stars, and shaped in the centre it bore the mark of the Great Council, a horse beneath a palm tree. This was Hamilcar's reply, the safe conduct that he sent them. They had nothing to fear. Any change of fortune brought with it the end of their woes. They were moved with extravagant joy. They embraced one another. They wept. Spendius, Auteritus, and Zaxas, 4 Italiotes, a Negro, and 2 Spartans offered themselves as envoys. They were immediately accepted. They did not know, however, by what means they should get away. But a cracking sounded in the direction of the rocks, and the most elevated of them, after rocking to and fro, rebounded to the bottom. In fact, if they were immovable on the side of the barbarians, for it would have been necessary to urge them up an inclined plane, and they were, moreover, heaped together owing to the narrowness of the gorge, on the others, on the contrary, it was sufficient to drive against them with violence to make them descend. The Carthaginians pushed them, and at daybreak they projected into the plain like the steps of an immense ruined staircase. The barbarians were still unable to climb them. Ladders were held out for their assistance. All rushed upon them. The discharge of a catapult drove the crowd back. Only the 10 were taken away. They walked amid the Clinabarians, leaning their hands on the horses' croups for support. Now that their first joy was over, they began to harbour anxieties. Hamilcar's demands would be cruel, but Spendius reassured them. "I will speak." And he boasted that he knew excellent things to say for the safety of the army. Behind all the bushes they met with ambushed sentries, who prostrated themselves before the sword belt which Spendius had placed over his shoulder. When they reached the Punic camp, the crowd flocked around them, and they thought that they could hear whisperings and laughter. The door of a tent opened. Hamilcar was at the very back of it, seated on a stool beside a table on which there shone a naked sword. He was surrounded by captains who were standing. He started back on perceiving these men, and then bent over to examine them. Their pupils were strangely dilated, and there was a great black circle around their eyes, which extended to the lower parts of their ears. Their bluish noses stood out between their hollow cheeks, which were chinked with deep wrinkles. The skin of their bodies was too large for their muscles, and was hidden beneath a slate-coloured dust. Their lips were glued to their yellow teeth. They exhaled an infectious odour. They might have been taken for half-opened tombs, for living sepulchres. In the centre of the tent, on a mat on which the captains were about to sit down, there was a dish of smoking gourds. The barbarians fastened their eyes upon it with a shivering in all their limbs, and tears came to their eyelids. Nevertheless they restrained themselves. Hamilcar turned away to speak to someone. Then they all flung themselves upon it, flat on the ground. Their faces were soaked in the fat, and the noise of their deglutition was mingled with the sobs of joy which they uttered. Through astonishment, doubtless, rather than pity, they were allowed to finish the mess. Then, when they had risen, Hamilcar with a sign commanded the man who bore the sword-belt to speak. Spendius was afraid. He stammered. Hamilcar, while listening to him, kept turning around on his finger a big gold ring, the same which had stamped the seal of Carthage upon the sword-belt. He let it fall to the ground. Spendius immediately picked it up. His servile habits came back to him in the presence of his master. The others quivered with indignation at such baseness. But the Greek raised his voice and spoke for a long time in rapid, insidious, and even violent fashion, setting forth the crimes of Hanno, whom he knew to be Barca's enemy, and striving to move Hamilcar's pity by the details of their miseries and the recollection of their devotion. In the end he became forgetful of himself, being carried away by the warmth of his temper. Hamilcar replied that he accepted their excuses. Peace, then, was about to be concluded, and now it would be a definite one. But he required that 10 mercenaries, chosen by himself, should be delivered up to him without their weapons or tunics. They had not expected such clemency. Spendius exclaimed, "Ah, 20 if you wish, master." "No, 10 will suffice," replied Hamilcar quietly. They were sent out of the tent to deliberate. As soon as they were alone, Autaritus protested against the sacrifice of their companions, and Zarxas said to Spendius, "Why did you not kill him? His sword was there beside you." "Him," said Spendius, "him! Him!" He repeated several times as though the thing had been impossible and Hamilcar were an immortal. They were so overwhelmed with weariness that they stretched themselves on their backs on the ground, not knowing at what resolution to arrive. Spendius urged them to yield. At last they consented, and went in again. Then the Suffet put his hand into the hands of the 10 barbarians in turn, and pressed their thumbs. Then he rubbed it on his garment, for their vicious skin gave a rude, soft impression to the touch, a greasy tingling which induced horripilation. Afterwards he said to them, "You are really all the chiefs of the barbarians, and you have sworn for them." "Yes," they replied. "Without constraint, from the bottom of your souls, with the intention of fulfilling your promises." They assured him that they were returning to the rest in order to fulfill them. "Well," rejoined the Suffet, "in accordance with the convention concluded between myself, Barca, and the ambassadors of the mercenaries, it is you whom I choose and shall keep." Spendius fell swooning upon the mat. The barbarians, as though abandoning him, pressed close together, and there was not a word, not a complaint. Their companions, who were waiting for them, not seeing them return, believed themselves betrayed. The envoys had no doubt given themselves up to the Suffet. They waited for 2 days longer, then on the morning of the third their resolution was taken. With ropes, picks and arrows, arranged like rungs between the strips of canvas, they succeeded in scaling the rocks, and leaving the weakest, about 3,000 in number, behind them, they began their march to rejoin the army at Tunis. Above the gorge there stretched a meadow thinly sown with shrubs. The barbarians devoured the buds. Afterwards they found a field of beans, and everything disappeared as though a cloud of grasshoppers had passed that way. 3 hours later they reached a second plateau bordered by a belt of green hills. Among the undulations of these hillocks silvery sheaves shone at intervals from one another. The barbarians, who were dazzled by the sun, could perceive confusedly below great black masses supporting them. These rose as though they were expanding. They were lances in towers on elephants terribly armed. Besides the spears on their breasts, the bodkin tusks, the brass plates which covered their sides, and the daggers fastened to their kneecaps, they had at the extremity of their tusks a leathern bracelet in which the handle of a broad cutlass was inserted. They had set out simultaneously from the back part of the plain, and were advancing on both sides in parallel lines. The barbarians were frozen with a nameless terror. They did not even try to flee. They already found themselves surrounded. The elephants entered into the mass of men, and the spears on their breasts divided it, the lances on their tusks upturned it like plowshares. They cut, hewed, and hacked with the scythes on their trunks. The towers, which were full of phalaricars, looked like volcanoes on the march. Nothing could be distinguished but a large heap, whereupon human flesh, pieces of brass and blood made white spots, grey sheets and red fuses. The horrible animals dug out black furrows as they passed through the midst of it all. The fiercest was driven by a Numidian who was crowned with a diadem of plumes. He hurled javelins with frightful quickness, giving at intervals a long, shrill whistle. The great beasts, docile as dogs, kept an eye on him during the carnage. The circle of them narrowed by degrees. The weakened barbarians offered no resistance. The elephants were soon in the centre of the plain. They lacked space. They thronged, half-rearing together, and their tusks clashed against one another. Suddenly Narr' Havas quieted them, and wheeling around, they trotted back to the hills. Two syntagmata, however, had taken refuge on the right in a bend of ground, had thrown away their arms, and were all kneeling with their faces towards the Punic tents, imploring mercy with uplifted arms. Their legs and hands were tied. Then, when they were stretched on the ground beside one another, the elephants were brought back. Their breasts cracked like boxes being forced. 2 were crushed at every step. The big feet sank into the bodies with the motion of the haunches, which made the elephants appear lame. They went on to the very end. The level surface of the plain again became motionless. Night fell. Hamilcar was delighting himself with the spectacle of his vengeance, but suddenly he started. He saw, and all saw, some more barbarians 600 paces to the left of the summit of a peak. In fact, 400 of the stoutest mercenaries, Etruscans, Libyans and Spartans had gained the heights at the beginning and had remained there in uncertainty until now. After the massacre of their companions, they resolved to make their way through the Carthaginians. They were already descending in serried columns in a marvellous and formidable fashion. A herald was immediately dispatched to them. The Suffet needed soldiers. He received them unconditionally, so greatly did he admire their bravery. They could even, said the man of Carthage, come a little nearer to a place, which he pointed out to them, where they would find provisions. The barbarians ran thither and spent the night in eating. Then the Carthaginians broke into clamours against the Suffet's partiality for the mercenaries. Did he yield to these outbursts of insatiable hatred, or was it a refinement of treachery? The next day he came himself, without a sword and bareheaded, with an escort of Clinabarians, and announced to them that having too many to feed, he did not intend to keep them. Nevertheless, as he wanted men and he knew of no means of selecting the good ones, they were to fight together to the death. He would then admit the conquerors into his own bodyguard. This death was quite as good as another, and then moving his soldiers aside, for the Punic standards hid the horizon from the mercenaries, he showed them the 192 elephants under Narr'Havas, forming a single straight line, their trunks brandishing broad steel blades like giant arms holding axes above their heads. The barbarians looked at one another silently. It was not death that made them turn pale, but the horrible compulsion to which they found themselves reduced. The community of their lives had brought about profound friendship among these men. The camp, with most, took the place of their country. Living without a family, they transferred the needful tenderness to a companion, and they would fall asleep in the starlight side by side under the same cloak. And then in their perpetual wanderings through all sorts of countries, murders and adventures, they had contracted affections, one for the other, in which the stronger protected the younger in the midst of battles, helped him to cross precipices, sponged the sweat of fevers from his brow, and stole food for him, and the weaker, a child perhaps, who had been picked up on the roadside and had then become a mercenary, repaid this devotion by 1,000 kindnesses. They exchanged their necklaces and earrings, presents which they had made to one another in former days, after great peril, or in hours of intoxication. All asked to die, and none would strike. A young fellow might be seen here and there, saying to another whose beard was grey, "No, no, you are more robust, you will avenge us, kill me." And the man would reply, "I have fewer years to live, strike to the heart and think no more about it." Brothers gazed on one another with clasped hands, and friend bade friend eternal farewells, standing and weeping upon his shoulder. They threw off their curses that the sword points might be thrust in the more quickly. Then there appeared the marks of the great blows which they had received for Carthage, and which looked like inscriptions on columns. They placed themselves in 4 equal ranks, after the fashion of gladiators, and began with timid engagements. Some had even bandaged their eyes, and their swords waved gently through the air like blind men's sticks. The Carthaginians hooted and shouted to them that they were cowards. The barbarians became animated, and soon the combat as general, headlong, and terrible. Sometimes 2 men, all covered with blood, would stop, fall into each other's arms, and die with mutual kisses. None drew back. They rushed upon the extended blades. Their delirium was so frenzied that the Carthaginians in the distance were afraid. At last they stopped. Their breasts made a great hoarse noise, and their eyeballs could be seen through their long hair, which hung down as though it had come out of a purple bath. Several were turning around rapidly, like panthers wounded in the forehead. Others stood motionless, looking at a corpse at their feet. Then they would suddenly tear their faces with their nails, take their swords with both hands, and plunge them into their own bodies. There were still 60 left. They asked for drink. They were told by shouts to throw away their swords, and when they had done so, water was brought to them. While they were drinking, with their faces buried in the vases, 60 Carthaginians leaped upon them and killed them with stilettos in the back. Hamilcar had done this to gratify the instincts of his army, and, by means of this treachery, to attach it to his own person. End of chapter 14, part 2. Chapter 14, Part 3 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 14, Part 3. The war, then, was ended. At least he believed that it was. Matho would not resist. In his impatience, the Suffet commanded an immediate departure. His scouts came to tell him that a convoy had been descried, departing towards the Lead Mountain. Hamilcar did not trouble himself about it. The mercenaries once annihilated, the nomads would give him no further trouble. The important matter was to take Tunis. He advanced by forced marches upon it. He had sent Narr'Havas to Carthage with the news of his victory, and the king of the Numidians, proud of his success, visited Salammbô. She received him in her gardens under a large sycamore tree, amid pillows of yellow leather, and with Tanach beside her. Her face was covered with a white scarf, which, passing over her mouth and forehead, allowed only her eyes to be seen, but her lips shone in the transparency of the tissue like the gems on her fingers, for Salammbô had both her hands wrapped up, and did not make a gesture during the whole conversation. Narr'Havas announced the defeat of the barbarians to her. She thanked him with a blessing for the services which he had rendered to her father. Then he began to tell her about the whole campaign. The doves on the palm trees around them cooed softly, and other birds fluttered amid the grass, ring-necked glariolas, Tartessus quails, and Punic guinea-fowl. The garden, long uncultivated, had multiplied its verdure. Coloquintidas mounted into the branches of cassias, the asclepias was scattered over the fields of roses. All kinds of vegetation formed entwinings and bowers, and here and there, as in the woods, sun-rays, descending obliquely, marked the shadow of a leaf upon the ground. Domestic animals, grown wild again, fled at the slightest noise. Sometimes a gazelle might be seen trailing scattered peacock's feathers after its little black hoofs. The clamours of the distant town were lost in the murmuring of the waves. The sky was quite blue, and not a sail was visible on the sea. Narr'Havas had ceased speaking. Salammbô was looking at him without replying. He wore a linen robe with flowers painted on it, and with gold fringes at the hem. 2 silver arrows fastened his plaited hair at the tips of his ears. His right hand rested on a pike-staff adorned with circles of electrum and tufts of hair. As she watched him, a crowd of dim thoughts absorbed her. This young man, with his gentle voice and feminine figure, captivated her eyes by the grace of his person, and seemed to her like an elder sister sent by the Baals to protect her. The recollection of Matho came upon her, nor did she resist the desire to learn what had become of him. Narr' Havas replied that the Carthaginians were advancing towards Tunis to take it. In proportion as he set forth their chances of success and Matho's weaknesses, she seemed to rejoice in extraordinary hope. Her lips trembled, her breast panted. When he finally promised to kill him himself, she exclaimed, "Yes, kill him, it must be so." The Numidian replied that he desired this death ardently, since he would be her husband when the war was over. Salammbô started and bent her head. But Narr' Havas, pursuing the subject, compared his longings to flowers languishing for rain, or to lost travellers waiting for the day. He told her further that she was more beautiful than the moon, better than the wind of morning, or than the face of a guest. He would bring for her from the country of the blacks things such as there were none in Carthage, and the apartments in their house should be sanded with gold dust. Evening fell, and odours of balsam were exhaled. For a long time they looked at each other in silence, and Salammbô's eyes, in the depth of her long draperies, resembled 2 stars in the rift of a cloud. Before the sun set he withdrew. The ancients felt themselves relieved of a great anxiety when he left Carthage. The people had received him with even more enthusiastic acclamations than on the first occasion. If Hamilcar and the king of the Numidians triumphed alone over the mercenaries, it would be impossible to resist them. To weaken Barca they therefore resolved to make the aged Hanno, him whom they loved, a sharer in the deliverance of Carthage. He proceeded immediately towards the western provinces to take his vengeance in the very places which had witnessed his shame. But the inhabitants and the barbarians were dead, hidden, or fled. Then his anger was vented upon the country. He burnt the ruins of the ruins. He did not leave a single tree nor a blade of grass. The children and the infirm that were met with were tortured. He gave the women to his soldiers to be violated before they were slaughtered. Often, on the crests of the hills, black tents were struck as though overturned by the wind, and broad, brilliantly bordered discs, which were recognized as being chariot wheels, revolved with a plaintive sound as they gradually disappeared in the valleys. The tribes, which had abandoned the siege of Carthage, were wandering in this way through the provinces, waiting for an opportunity, or for some victory to be gained by the mercenaries in order to return. But whether from terror or famine, they all took the roads to their native lands, and disappeared. Hamilcar was not jealous of Hanno's successes. Nevertheless, he was in a hurry to end matters. He commanded him to fall back upon Tunis, and Hanno, who loved his country, was under the walls of the town on the appointed day. For its protection, it had its aboriginal population, 12,000 mercenaries, and, in addition, all the eaters of uncleanness, for like Matho they were riveted to the horizon of Carthage, and plebs and schalischim gazed at its lofty walls from afar, looking back in thought to boundless enjoyments. With this harmony of hatred, resistance was briskly organized. Leathern bottles were taken to make helmets, all the palm trees in the gardens were cut down for lances, cisterns were dug, while for provisions they caught on the shores of the lake big white fish, fed on corpses and filth. Their ramparts, kept in ruins now by the jealousy of Carthage, were so weak that they could be thrown down with a push of the shoulder. Matho stopped up the holes in them with the stones of the houses. It was the last struggle. He hoped for nothing, and yet he told himself that fortune was fickle. As the Carthaginians approached, they noticed a man on the rampart who towered over the battlements from his belt upwards. The arrows that flew about him seemed to frighten him no more than a swarm of swallows. Extraordinary to say, none of them touched him. Hamilcar pitched his camp on the south side. Narr'havas, to his right, occupied the plain of Rhades, and Hanno the shore of the lake, and the three generals were to maintain their respective positions so as all to attack the walls simultaneously. But Hamilcar wished first to show the mercenaries that he would punish them like slaves. He had the 10 ambassadors crucified beside one another on a hillock in front of the town. At the sight of this, the besieged forsook the rampart. Matho had said to himself that if he could pass between the walls and Narr'havas's tents with such rapidity that the Numidians had not time to come out, he would fall upon the rear of the Carthaginian infantry, who would be caught between his division and those inside. He dashed out with his veterans. Narr'havas perceived him. He crossed the shore of the lake and came to warn Hanno to dispatch men to Hamilcar's assistance. Did he believe Barca too weak to resist the mercenaries? Was it a piece of treachery or folly? No one could ever learn. Hanno, desiring to humiliate his rival, did not hesitate. He shouted orders to sound the trumpets, and his whole army rushed upon the barbarians. The latter returned, and ran straight against the Carthaginians. They knocked them down, crushed them under their feet, and driving them back in this way, reached the tent of Hanno, who was then surrounded by 30 Carthaginians, the most illustrious of the ancients. He appeared stupefied by their audacity. He called for his captains. Everyone thrust his fist under his throat, vociferating abuse. The crowd pressed on, and those who had their hands on him could scarce retain their hold. However, he tried to whisper to them, "I will give you whatever you want. I am rich. Save me." They dragged him along. Heavy as he was, his feet did not touch the ground. The ancients had been carried off. His terror increased. "You have beaten me. I am your captive. I will ransom myself. Listen to me, my friends." And borne along by all those shoulders which were pressed against his sides, he repeated, "What are you going to do? What do you want? You can see that I am not obstinate. I have always been good-natured." A gigantic cross stood at the gate. The barbarians howled, "Here! Here!" But he raised his voice still higher, and in the names of their gods he called upon them to lead him to the schalischim, because he wished to confide to him something on which their safety depended. They paused, some asserting that it was right to summon Matho. He was sent for. Hanno fell upon the grass, and he saw around him other crosses also, as though the torture by which he was about to perish had been multiplied beforehand. He made efforts to convince himself that he was mistaken, that there was only one, and even to believe that there were none at all. At last he was lifted up. "Speak," said Matho. He offered to give up Hamilcar, then they would enter Carthage and both be kings. Matho withdrew, signing to the others to make haste. It was a stratagem, he thought, to gain time. The barbarian was mistaken. Hanno was in an extremity when consideration is had to nothing, and moreover, he so execrated Hamilcar that he would have sacrificed him and all his soldiers on the slightest hope of safety. The ancients were languishing on the ground at the foot of the crosses. Ropes had already been passed beneath their armpits. Then the old Suffet, understanding that he must die, wept. They tore off the clothes that were still left on him, and the horror of his person appeared. Ulcers covered the nameless mass. The fat on his legs hid the nails on his feet. From his fingers there hung what looked like greenish strips, and the tears streaming through the tubercles on his cheeks gave to his face an expression of frightful sadness, for they seemed to take up more room than on another human face. His royal fillet, which was half unfastened, trailed with his white hair in the dust. They thought that they had no ropes strong enough to haul him up to the top of the cross, and they nailed him upon it, after the Punic fashion, before it was erected. But his pride awoke in his pain. He began to overwhelm them with abuse. He foamed and twisted like a marine monster being slaughtered on the shore, and predicted that they would all end more horribly still, and that he would be avenged. He was. On the other side of the town, whence there now escaped jets of flame with columns of smoke, the ambassadors from the mercenaries were in their last throes. Some who had swooned at first had just revived in the freshness of the wind, but their chins still rested upon their breasts, and their bodies had fallen somewhat, in spite of the nails in their arms, which were fastened higher than their heads. From their heels and hands blood fell in big, slow drops, as ripe fruit falls from the branches of a tree. And Carthage, gulf, mountains and plains, all appeared to them to be revolving like an immense wheel. Sometimes a cloud of dust, rising from the ground, enveloped them in its eddies. They burned with horrible thirst, their tongues curled in their mouths, and they felt an icy sweat flowing over them with their departing souls. Nevertheless they had glimpses, at an indefinite depth, of streets, marching soldiers, and the swinging of swords, and the tumults of battle reached them dimly like the noise of the sea to shipwrecked men dying on the masts of a ship. The Italiotes, who were sturdier than the rest, were still shrieking. The Lacedaemonians were silent, with eyelids closed. Zaxas, once so vigorous, was bending like a broken reed. The Ethiopian beside him had his head thrown back over the arms of the cross. Oterites was motionless, rolling his eyes. His great head of hair, caught in a cleft in the wood, fell straight upon his forehead, and his death rattle seemed rather to be a roar of anger. As to Spendius, a strange courage had come to him. He despised life now in the certainty which he possessed of an almost immediate and an eternal emancipation, and he awaited death with impassibility. Amid their swooning, they sometimes started at the brushing of feathers passing across their lips. Large wings swung shadows around them, croakings sounded in the air, and as Spendius's cross was the highest, it was upon his that the first vulture alighted. Then he turned his face towards Autaritus, and said slowly to him, with an unaccountable smile, "Do you remember the lions on the road to Sicca?" "They were our brothers," replied the Gaul as he expired. The Suffet, meanwhile, had bored through the walls and reached the citadel. The smoke suddenly disappeared before a gust of wind, discovering the horizon as far as the walls of Carthage. He even thought that he could distinguish people watching on the platform of Eschmoun. Then, bringing back his eyes, he perceived 30 crosses of extravagant size on the shore of the lake to the left. In fact, to render them still more frightful, they had been constructed with tent poles fastened end to end, and the 30 corpses of the ancients appeared high up in the sky. They had what looked like white butterflies on their breasts. These were the feathers of the arrows which had been shot at them from below. A broad gold ribbon shone on the summit of the highest. It hung down to the shoulder, there being no arm on that side, and Hamilcar had some difficulty in recognizing Hanno. His spongy bones had given way under the iron pins, portions of his limbs had come off, and nothing was left on the cross but shapeless remains, like the fragments of animals that are hung up on huntsmen's doors. The Suffet could not have known anything about it. The town in front of him masked everything that was beyond and behind, and the captains who had been successively sent to the 2 generals had not reappeared. Then fugitives arrived with the tale of the rout, and the Punic army halted. This catastrophe, falling upon them as it did in the midst of their victory, stupefied them. Hamilcar's orders were no longer listened to. Matho took advantage of this to continue his ravages among the Numidians. Hanno's camp having been overthrown, he had returned against them. The elephants came out, but the mercenaries advanced through the plain shaking about flaming firebrands, which they had plucked from the walls, and the great beasts, in fright, ran headlong into the gulf, where they killed one another in their struggles, or were drowned beneath the weight of their cuirasses. Narr'Havas had already launched his cavalry. All threw themselves face downwards upon the ground. Then, when the horses were within 3 paces of them, they sprang beneath their bellies, ripped them open with dagger strokes, and half the Numidians had perished when Barca came up. The exhausted mercenaries could not withstand his troops. They retired in good order to the mountain of the hot springs. The Suffet was prudent enough not to pursue them. He directed his course to the mouths of the Macaras. Tunis was his, but it was now nothing but a heap of smoking rubbish. The ruins fell through the breaches in the walls to the centre of the plain. Quite in the background, between the shores of the gulf, the corpses of the elephants drifting before the wind conflicted, like an archipelago of black rocks floating on the water. Narr'Havas had drained his forests of these animals, taking young and old, male and female, to keep up the war, and the military force of his kingdom could not repair the loss. The people who had seen them perishing at a distance were grieved at it. Men lamented in the streets, calling them by their names like deceased friends. Ah, the invincible, the victory, the thunderer, the swallow! On the first day, too, there was no talk except of the dead citizens. But on the morrow the tents of the mercenaries were seen on the mountain of the hot springs. Then so deep was the despair that many people, especially women, flung themselves headlong from the top of the Acropolis. Hamilcar's designs were not known. He lived alone in his tent with none near him but a young boy, and no one ever ate with them, not even excepting Narr'Havas. Nevertheless, he showed great deference to the latter after Hanno's defeat, but the king of the Numidians had too great an interest in becoming his son not to distrust him. This inertness veiled skilful manoeuvres. Hamilcar seduced the heads of the villages by all sorts of artifices, and the mercenaries were hunted, repulsed, and enclosed like wild beasts. As soon as they entered a wood, the trees caught fire around them. When they drank of a spring, it was poisoned. The caves in which they hid in order to sleep were walled up. Their old accomplices, the populations who had hitherto defended them, now pursued them, and they continually recognized Carthaginian armour in these bands. Many had their faces consumed with red tears. This, they thought, had come to them through touching Hanno. Others imagined that it was because they had eaten Salammbô's fishes, and far from repenting of it, they dreamt of even more abominable sacrileges, so that the abasement of the Punic gods might still be greater. They would fain have exterminated them. End of chapter 14, part 3. Chapter 14, part 4 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 14, part 4. In this way they lingered for 3 months along the eastern coast, and then behind the mountain of Selum, and as far as the first sands of the desert. They sought for a place of refuge, no matter where. Utica and Hippozarytus alone had not betrayed them, but Hamilcar was encompassing these 2 towns. Then they went northwards at haphazard without even knowing the various routes. Their many miseries had confused their understandings. The only feeling left them was one of exasperation, which went on developing, and one day they found themselves again in the gorges of Cobus and once more before Carthage. Then the actions multiplied. Fortune remained equal, but both sides were so wearied that they would willingly have exchanged these skirmishes for a great battle, provided that it were really the last. Matho was inclined to carry this proposal himself to the Suffet. One of his Libyans devoted himself for the purpose. All were convinced as they saw him depart that he would not return. He returned the same evening. Hamilcar accepted the challenge. The encounter should take place the following day at sunrise in the plain of Rhades. The mercenaries wished to know whether he had said anything more, and the Libyan added, "As I remained in his presence he asked me what I was waiting for. 'To be killed,' I replied. Then he rejoined, 'No, be gone. That will be tomorrow with the rest.'" This generosity astonished the barbarians. Some were terrified by it, and Matho regretted that the emissary had not been killed. He had still remaining 3,000 Africans, 1,200 Greeks, 1,500 Campanians, 200 Iberians, 400 Etruscans, 500 Samnites, 40 Gauls, and a troop of Nafurs, nomad bandits met with in the Date region. In all 7,219 soldiers, but not one complete syntagmata. They had stopped up the holes in their cuirasses with the shoulder blades of quadrupeds, and replaced their brass cothurni with worn sandals. Their garments were weighted with copper or steel plates. Their coats of mail hung in tatters about them, and scars appeared like purple threads through the hair on their arms and faces. The wraiths of their dead companions came back to their souls and increased their energy. They felt, in a confused way, that they were the ministers of a god diffused in the hearts of the oppressed, and were the pontiffs, so to speak, of universal vengeance. Then they were enraged with grief at what was extravagant injustice, and above all by the sight of Carthage on the horizon. They swore an oath to fight for one another until death. The beasts of burden were killed, and as much as possible was eaten so as to gain strength. Afterwards they slept. Some prayed, turning towards different constellations. The Carthaginians arrived first in the plain. They rubbed the edges of their shields with oil to make the arrows glide off them easily. The foot soldiers, who wore long hair, took the precaution of cutting it on the forehead, and Hamilcar ordered all bowls to be inverted from the 5th hour, knowing that it is disadvantageous to fight with the stomach too full. His army amounted to 14,000 men, or about double the number of the barbarians. Nevertheless, he had never felt such anxiety. If he succumbed, it would mean the annihilation of the Republic, and he would perish on the cross. If, on the contrary, he triumphed, he would reach Italy by way of the Pyrenees, the Gauls and the Alps, and the empire of the Barcas would become eternal. 20 times during the night he rose to inspect everything himself, down to the most trifling details. As to the Carthaginians, they were exasperated by their lengthened terror. Narr'Havas suspected the fidelity of his Numidians. Moreover, the barbarians might vanquish them. A strange weakness had come upon him. Every moment he drank large cups of water. But a man whom he did not know opened his tent and laid on the ground a crown of rock salt, adorned with hieratic designs formed with sulphur, and lozenges of mother-of-pearl. A marriage crown was sometimes sent to a betrothed husband. It was a proof of love, a sort of invitation. Nevertheless, Hamilcar's daughter had no tenderness for Narr'Havas. The recollection of Matho disturbed her in an intolerable manner. It seemed to her that the death of this man would unburden her thoughts, just as people, to cure themselves of the bite of a viper, crush it upon the wound. The king of the Numidians was depending upon her. He awaited the wedding with impatience, and, as it was to follow the victory, Salammbô made him this present to stimulate his courage. Then his distress vanished, and he thought only of the happiness of possessing so beautiful a woman. The same vision had assailed Matho, but he cast it from him immediately, and his love, that he thus thrust back, was poured out upon his companions in arms. He cherished them like portions of his own person, of his hatred, and he felt his spirit higher and his arms stronger. Everything that he was to accomplish appeared clearly before him. If sighs sometimes escaped him, it was because he was thinking of Spendius. He drew up the barbarians in 6 equal ranks. He posted the Etruscans in the centre, all being fastened to a bronze chain. The archers were behind, and on the wings he distributed the Naffurs, who were mounted on short-haired camels covered with ostrich feathers. The Suffet arranged the Carthaginians in similar order. He placed the Clinabarians outside the infantry next to the Velites, and the Numidians beyond. When day appeared, both sides were thus in line face to face. All gazed at each other from a distance with round, fierce eyes. There was at first some hesitation. At last both armies moved. The barbarians advanced slowly so as not to become out of breath. Beating the ground with their feet, the centre of the Punic army formed a convex curve. Then came the burst of a terrible shock, like the crash of two fleets in collision. The first rank of the barbarians had quickly opened up, and the marksmen, hidden behind the others, discharged their bullets, arrows, and javelins. The curve of the Carthaginians, however, flattened by degrees, became quite straight, and then bent inwards. Upon this, the two sections of the velites drew together in parallel lines, like the legs of a compass that is being closed. The barbarians, who were attacking the phalanx with fury, entered the gap. They were being lost. Matho checked them, and while the Carthaginian wings continued to advance, he drew out the three inner ranks of his line. They soon covered his flanks, and his army appeared in triple array. But the barbarians placed at the extremities were the weakest, especially those on the left, who had exhausted their quivers, and the troop of velites, which had at last come up against them, was cutting them up greatly. Matho made them fall back. His right comprised Campanians, who were armed with axes. He hurled them against the Carthaginian left, the centre attacked the enemy, and those at the other extremity, who were out of peril, kept the velites at a distance. Then Hamilcar divided his horsemen into squadrons, placed hoplites between them, and sent them against the mercenaries. Those cone-shaped masses presented a front of horses, and their broader sides were filled and bristling with lances. The barbarians found it impossible to resist. The Greek foot soldiers alone had brazen armor, all the rest had cutlasses on the end of poles, scythes taken from the farms, or swords manufactured out of the fellies of wheels. The soft blades were twisted by a blow, and while they were engaged in straightening them under their heels, the Carthaginians massacred them right and left at their ease. But the Etruscans, riveted to their chain, did not stir. Those who were dead, being prevented from falling, formed an obstruction with their corpses, and the great bronze line widened and contracted in turn, as supple as a serpent, and as impregnable as a wall. The barbarians would come to reform behind it, pant for a minute, and then set off again with the fragments of their weapons in their hands. Many already had none left, and they leaped upon the Carthaginians, biting their faces like dogs. The Gauls in their pride stripped themselves of the sagum, they showed their great white bodies from a distance, and they enlarged their wounds to terrify the enemy. The voice of the crier announcing the orders could no longer be heard in the midst of the Punic syntagmata. Their signals were being repeated by the standards, which were raised above the dust, and every one was swept away in the swaying of the great mass that surrounded him. Hamilcar commanded the Numidians to advance, but the Naffurs rushed to meet them. Clad in vast black robes, with a tuft of hair on the top of the skull and a shield of rhinoceros leather, they wielded a steel which had no handle and which they held by a rope, and their camels, which bristled all over with feathers, uttered long, hoarse cluckings. Each blade fell on a precise spot, then rose again with a smart stroke carrying off a limb with it. The fierce beasts galloped through the syntagmata. Some, whose legs were broken, went hopping along like wounded ostriches. The Punic infantry turned in a body upon the barbarians and cut them off. Their maniples wheeled about at intervals from one another. The more brilliant Carthaginian weapons encircled them like golden crowns. There was a swarming movement in the centre, and the sun, striking down upon the points of the swords, made them glitter with white flickering gleams. However, files of Clinabarians lay stretched upon the plain. Some mercenaries snatched away their armour, clothed themselves in it, and then returned to the fray. The deluded Carthaginians were several times entangled in their midst. They would stand stupidly motionless, or else would back, surge again, and triumphant shouts rising in the distance seemed to drive them along like derelicts in a storm. Hamilcar was growing desperate. All was about to perish beneath the genius of Matho and the invincible courage of the mercenaries. But a great noise of tambourines burst forth on the horizon. It was a crowd of old men, sick persons, children of 15 years of age, and even women, who, being unable to withstand their distress any longer, had set out from Carthage, and, for the purpose of placing themselves under the protection of something formidable, had taken from Hamilcar's palace the only elephant that the Republic now possessed, that one, namely, whose trunk had been cut off. Then it seemed to the Carthaginians that their country, forsaking its walls, was coming to command them to die for her. They were seized with increased fury, and the Numidians carried away all the rest. The barbarians had set themselves with their backs to a hillock in the centre of the plain. They had no chance of conquering, or even of surviving, but they were the best, the most intrepid, and the strongest. The people from Carthage began to throw spits, larding pins and hammers over the heads of the Numidians. Those whom consuls had feared died beneath sticks hurled by women. The Punic populace was exterminating the mercenaries. The latter had taken refuge on the top of the hill. Their circle closed up every fresh breach. Twice it descended to be immediately repulsed with a shock, and the Carthaginians stretched forth their arms pell-mell, thrusting their pikes between the legs of their companions, and raking at random before them. They slipped in the blood. The steep slope of the ground made the corpses roll to the bottom. The elephant, which was trying to climb the hillock, was up to its belly. It seemed to be crawling over them with delight, and its shortened trunk, which was broad at the extremity, rose from time to time like an enormous leech. Then all paused. The Carthaginians ground their teeth as they gazed at the hill where the barbarians were standing. At last they dashed at them abruptly, and the fight began again. The mercenaries would often let them approach, shouting to them that they wished to surrender. Then, with frightful sneers, they would kill themselves at a blow, and as the dead fell, the rest would mount upon them to defend themselves. It was a kind of pyramid which grew larger by degrees. Soon there were only 50, then only 20, only 3, and lastly only 2, a Samnite armed with an axe, and Matho who still had his sword. The Samnite with bent hams swept his axe alternately to the right and left, at the same time warning Matho of the blows that were being aimed at him. "Master, this way, that way, stoop down." Matho had lost his shoulder-pieces, his helmet, his cuirass. He was completely naked and more livid than the dead, with his hair quite erect, and 2 patches of foam at the corners of his lips, and his sword whirled so rapidly that it formed an aureola around him. A stone broke it near the guard, the Samnite was killed, and the flood of Carthaginians closed in. They touched Matho. Then he raised both his empty hands towards heaven, closed his eyes, and, opening out his arms like a man throwing himself from the summit of a promontory into the sea, hurled himself among the pikes. They moved away before him. Several times he ran against the Carthaginians, but they always drew back and turned their weapons aside. His foot struck against a sword. Matho tried to seize it. He felt himself tied by the wrists and knees, and fell. Narr'Havas had been following him for some time, step by step, with one of the large nets used for capturing wild beasts, and, taking advantage of the moment when he stooped down, had involved him in it. Then he was fastened on the elephants with his 4 limbs forming a cross, and all those who were not wounded escorted him and rushed with great tumult towards Carthage. The news of the victory had arrived some inexplicable way at the 3rd hour of the night. The clepsydra of Khamon had just completed the 5th as they reached Malqua. Then Matho opened his eyes. There were so many lights in the houses that the town appeared to be all in flames. An immense clamour reached him dimly, and lying on his back he looked at the stars. Then a door closed and he was wrapped in darkness. On the morrow, at the same hour, the last of the men left in the pass of the Hatchet expired. On the day that their companions had set out, some Zuaics who were returning had tumbled the rocks down and had fed them for some time. The barbarians constantly expected to see Matho appear, and from discouragement, from languor, and from the obstinacy of sick men who object to change their situation, they would not leave the mountain. At last the provisions were exhausted, and the Zuaics went away. It was known that they numbered scarcely more than 1,300 men, and there was no need to employ soldiers to put an end to them. Wild beasts, especially lions, had multiplied during the 3 years that the war had lasted. Narr'Havas had held a great battue, and after tying goats at intervals, had run upon them and so driven them towards the pass of the Hatchet, and they were now all living in it when a man arrived who had been sent by the ancients to find out what there was left of the barbarians. Lions and corpses were lying over the tract of the plain, and the dead were mingled with clothes and armour. Nearly all had the face or an arm wanting. Some appeared to be still intact, others were completely dried up, and their helmets were filled with powdery skulls. Feet which had lost their flesh stood out straight from the nimids. Skeletons still wore their cloaks, and bones, cleaned by the sun, made gleaming spots in the midst of the sand. The lions were resting with their breasts against the ground, and both paws stretched out, winking their eyelids in the bright daylight, which was heightened by the reflection from the white rocks. Others were seated on their hind quarters and staring before them, or else were sleeping, rolled into a ball and half hidden by their great manes. They all looked well fed, tired and dull. They were as motionless as the mountain and the dead. Night was falling. The sky was striped with broad red bands in the west. In one of the heaps which in an irregular fashion embossed the plain, something rose up vaguer than a spectre. Then one of the lions set himself in motion, his monstrous form cutting a black shadow on the background of the purple sky, and when he was quite close to the man, he knocked him down with a single blow of his paw. Then, stretching himself flat upon him, he slowly drew out the entrails with the edge of his teeth. Afterwards he opened his huge jaws, and for some minutes uttered a lengthened roar, which was repeated by the echoes in the mountain, and was finally lost in the solitude. Suddenly some small gravel rolled down from above. The rustling of rapid steps was heard, and in the direction of the portcullis and of the gorge there appeared pointed muzzles and straight ears, with gleaming, tawny eyes. These were the jackals coming to eat what was left. The Carthaginian, who was leaning over the top of the precipice to look, went back again. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Carolyn. Chapter 15. Matho. There were rejoicings at Carthage. Rejoicings deep, universal, extravagant, frantic. The holes of the ruins had been stopped up, the statues of the gods had been repainted, the streets were strewn with myrtle branches, incense smoked at the corners of the crossways, and the throng on the terraces looked, in their variegated garments, like heaps of flowers blooming in the air. The shouts of the water-carriers watering the pavement rose above the continual screaming of voices. Slaves belonging to Hamilcar offered in his name roasted barley and pieces of raw meat. People accosted one another and embraced one another with tears. The Tyrian towns were taken, the nomads dispersed, and all the barbarians annihilated. The Acropolis was hidden beneath coloured velaria, the beaks of the triremes, drawn up in line outside the mole, shone like a dike of diamonds. Everywhere there was a sense of the restoration of order, the beginning of a new existence, and the diffusion of vast happiness. It was the day of Salammbô's marriage with the king of the Numidians. On the terrace of the temple of Khamon there were 3 long tables laden with gigantic plate, at which the priests, ancients, and the rich were to sit, and there was a 4th and higher one for Hamilcar, Narr'Havas, and Salammbô, for as she had saved her country by the restoration of the Zaïmph, the people turned her wedding day into a national rejoicing, and were waiting in the square below till she should appear. But their impatience was excited by another and more acrid longing. Matho's death has been promised for the ceremony. It had been proposed at first to flay him alive, to pour lead into his entrails, to kill him with hunger. He should be tied to a tree, and an ape behind him should strike him on the head with a stone. He had offended Tanith, and the cynocephalosis of Tanith should avenge her. Others were of opinion that he should be led about on a dromedary after linen wicks, dipped in oil, had been inserted in his body in several places, and they took pleasure in the thought of the large animal wandering through the streets, with this man writhing beneath the fires like a candelabrum blown about by the wind. But what citizens should be charged with his torture, and why disappoint the rest? They would have liked a kind of death in which the whole town might take part, in which every hand, every weapon, everything Carthaginian, to the very paving stones in the streets and the waves in the gulf, could rend him and crush him and annihilate him. Accordingly the ancients decided that he should go from his prison to the square of Khamon without any escort, and with his arms fastened to his back. It was forbidden to strike him to the heart, in order that he might live the longer, to put out his eyes, so that he might see the torture through, to hurl anything against his person, or to lay more than 3 fingers upon him at a time. Although he was not to appear until the end of the day, the people sometimes fancied that he could be seen, and the crowd would rush towards the Acropolis and empty the streets, to return with lengthened murmurings. Some people had remained standing in the same place since the day before, and they would call on one another from a distance and show their nails which they had allowed to grow, the better to bury them in his flesh. Others walked restlessly up and down. Some were as pale as though they were awaiting their own execution. Suddenly lofty feather fans rose above the heads behind the Mappalian district. It was Salammbô leaving her palace. A sigh of relief found vent. But the procession was long in coming. It marched with deliberation. First there filed past the priests of the Partaic gods, then those of Eschmoun, of Melkarth, and all the other colleges in succession, with the same insignia, and in the same order as had been observed at the time of the sacrifice. The pontiffs of Moloch passed with heads bent, and the multitude stood aside from them in a kind of remorse. But the priests of Rabetna advanced with a proud step, and with lyres in their hands. The priestesses followed them in transparent robes of yellow or black, uttering cries like birds, and writhing like vipers, or else whirling around to the sound of flutes to imitate the dance of the stars, while their light garments wafted puffs to delicate scents through the streets. The Kediskim, with painted eyelids, who symbolized the hermaphrodism of the divinity, received applause among these women, and being perfumed and dressed like them, they resembled them in spite of their flat breasts and narrower hips. Moreover, on this day the female principle dominated and confused all things. A mystic voluptuousness moved in the heavy air. The torches were already lighted in the depth of the sacred woods. There was to be a great celebration there during the night. 3 vessels had brought courtesans from Sicily, and others had come from the desert. As the colleges arrived, they ranged themselves in the courts of the temples, on the outer galleries, and along double staircases, which rose against the walls, and drew together at the top. Files of white robes appeared between the colonnades, and the architecture was peopled with human statues, motionless as statues of stone. Then came the masters of the exchequer, the governors of the provinces, and all the rich. A great tumult prevailed below. Adjacent streets were discharging the crowd. Hero duels were driving it back with blows of sticks. And then Salammbô appeared in a litter surmounted by a purple canopy and surrounded by the ancients crowned with their golden tiaras. Thereupon an immense shout arose, the cymbals and crotala sounded more loudly, the tabourines thundered, and the great purple canopy sank between the two pylons. It appeared again on the first landing. Salammbô was walking slowly beneath it. Then she crossed the terrace to take her seat behind on a kind of throne cut out of the carapace of a tortoise. An ivory stool with 3 steps was pushed beneath her feet. 2 Negro children knelt on the edge of the first step, and sometimes she would rest both arms, which were laden with rings of excessive weight, upon their heads. From ankle to hip she was covered with a network of narrow meshes, which were in imitation of fish scales, and shone like mother of pearl. Her waist was clasped by a blue zone, which allowed her breasts to be seen through 2 crescent-shaped slashings. The nipples were hidden by carbuncle pendants. She had a head-dress made of peacock's feathers studded with gems. An ample cloak, as white as snow, fell behind her, and with her elbows at her sides, her knees pressed together, and circles of diamonds on the upper part of her arms, she remained perfectly upright in a hieratic attitude. Her father and her husband were on 2 lower seats. Narr'Havas, dressed in a light simar, and wearing his crown of rock salt, from which there strayed 2 tresses of hair as twisted as the horns of Ammon, and Hamilcar in a violet tunic figured with gold vine branches, and with a battle-sword at his side. The python of the temple of Eschmoun lay on the ground amid pools of pink oil, in the space enclosed by the tables, and, biting its tail, described a large black circle. In the middle of the circle there was a copper pillar bearing a crystal egg, and, as the sun shone upon it, rays were emitted on every side. Behind Salammbô stretched the priests of Tanith in linen robes. On her right the ancients in their tiaras formed a great gold line, and on the other side the rich with their emerald sceptres a great green line, while quite in the background, where the priests of Moloch were ranged, the cloaks looked like a wall of purple. The other colleges occupied the lower terraces. The multitude obstructed the streets. It reached to the housetops and extended in long files to the summit of the Acropolis. Having thus the people at her feet, the firmament above her head, and around her the immensity of the sea, the gulf, the mountains, and the distant provinces, Salammbô in her splendour was blended with Tanith, and seemed the very genius of Carthage and its embodied soul. The feast was to last all night, and lamps with several branches were planted like trees on the painted woolen cloths which covered the low tables. Large electrum flagons, blue glass amphoras, tortoise-shell spoons, and small round loaves were crowded between the double row of pearl-bordered plates. Bunches of grapes with their leaves had been rolled around ivory vine-stalks after the fashion of the Thyrsus. Blocks of snow were melting on ebony trays, and lemons, pomegranates, gourds, and watermelons formed hillocks beneath the lofty silver plate. Boars with open jaws were wallowing in the dust of spices. Hares, covered with their fur, appeared to be bounding amid the flowers. There were shells filled with force-meat. The pastry had symbolic shapes, When the covers of the dishes were removed, doves flew out. The slaves, meanwhile, with tunics tucked up, were going about on tiptoe. From time to time a hymn sounded on the lyres, or a choir of voices rose. The clamour of the people, continuous as the noise of the sea, floated vaguely around the feast, and seemed to lull it in a broader harmony. Some recalled the banquet of the mercenaries. They gave themselves up to dreams of happiness. The sun was beginning to go down, and the crescent of the moon was already rising in another part of the sky. But Salammbô turned her head as though someone had called her. The people, who were watching her, followed the direction of her eyes. The door of the dungeon, hewn in the rock at the foot of the temple, on the summit of the Acropolis, had just opened, and a man was standing on the threshold of this black hole. He came forth bent double, with the scared look of fallow deer when suddenly enlarged. The light dazzled him. He stood motionless a while. All had recognized him, and they all held their breath. In their eyes the body of this victim was something peculiarly theirs, and was adorned with almost religious splendor. They bent forward to see him, especially the women. They burned to gaze upon him who had caused the deaths of their children and husbands, and from the bottom of their souls there sprang up, in spite of themselves, an infamous curiosity, a desire to know him completely, a wish mingled with remorse, which turned to increased execration. At last he advanced, then the stupefaction of surprise disappeared. Numbers of arms were raised, and he was lost to sight. The staircase of the Acropolis had 60 steps. He descended them as though he were rolled down in a torrent from the top of a mountain. 3 times he was seen to leap, and then he alighted below on his feet. His shoulders were bleeding, his breast was panting with great shocks, and he made such efforts to burst his bonds that his arms, which were crossed on his naked loins, swelled like pieces of a serpent. Several streets began in front of him, leading from the spot at which he found himself. In each of them a triple row of bronze chains fastened to the navels of the Pataic guards extended in parallel lines from one end to the other. The crowd was massed against the houses, and servants, belonging to the ancients, walked in the middle brandishing thongs. One of them drove him forward with a great blow. Matho began to move. They thrust their arms over the chains, shouting out that the road had been left too wide for him, and he passed along, felt, pricked and slashed by all those fingers. When he reached the end of one street, another appeared. Several times he flung himself to one side to bite them. They speedily dispersed, the chains held him back, and the crowd burst out laughing. A child rent his ear. A young girl, hiding the point of a spindle in her sleeve, split his cheek. They tore handfuls of hair from him and strips of flesh. Others smeared his face with sponges steeped in filth and fastened upon sticks. A stream of blood started from the right side of his neck. Frenzy immediately set in. This last barbarian was to them a representative of all the barbarians and all the army. They were taking vengeance on him for their disasters, their terrors, and their shame. The rage of the mob developed with its gratification. The curving chains were overstrained and were on the point of breaking. The people did not feel the blows of the slaves, who struck at them to drive them back. Some clung to the projections of the houses. All the openings in the walls were stopped up with heads, and they howled at him the mischief that they could not inflict upon him. It was atrocious, filthy abuse mingled with ironical encouragements and imprecations, and, his present tortures not being enough for them, they foretold to him others that should be still more terrible in eternity. This vast baying filled Carthage with stupid continuity. Frequently a single syllable, a hoarse, deep and frantic intonation, would be repeated for several minutes by the entire people. The walls would vibrate with it from top to bottom, and both sides of the street would seem to Matho to be coming against him and carrying him off the ground, like two immense arms stifling him in the air. Nevertheless, he remembered that he had experienced something like it before. The same crowd was on the terraces, there were the same looks and the same wrath, but then he had walked free. All had then dispersed, for a guard covered him, and the recollection of this, gaining precision by degrees, brought a crushing sadness upon him. Shadows passed before his eyes, the town whirled round in his head, his blood streamed from a wound in his hip. He felt that he was dying, his hams bent, and he sank quite gently upon the pavement. Someone went to the peristyle of the temple of Melkarth, took thence the bar of a tripod, heated red-hot in the coals, and slipping it beneath the first chain, pressed it against his wound. The flesh was seen to smoke. The hootings of the people drowned his voice. He was standing again. 6 paces further on, and he fell a third and again a fourth time, but some new torture always made him rise. They discharged little drops of boiling oil through tubes at him. They strewed pieces of broken glass beneath his feet. Still he walked on. At the corner of the street of Satip, he leaned his back against the wall beneath the penthouse of a shop, and advanced no further. The slaves of the council struck him with their whips of hippopotamus leather so furiously and long that the fringes of their tunics were drenched with sweat. Matho appeared insensible. Suddenly he started off and began to run at random, making a noise with his lips like one shivering with severe cold. He threaded the street of Boots and the street of Sopo, crossed the Green Market, and reached the square of Khamon. He now belonged to the priests. The slaves had just dispersed the crowd, and there was more room. Matho gazed around him, and his eyes encountered Salammbô. At the first step that he had taken, she had risen. Then, as he approached, she had involuntarily advanced by degrees to the edge of the terrace, and soon all external things were blotted out, and she saw only Matho. Silence fell in her soul, one of those abysses wherein the whole world disappears beneath the pressure of a single thought, a memory, a look. This man who was walking towards her attracted her. Excepting his eyes, he had no appearance of humanity left. He was a long, perfectly red shape. His broken bonds hung down his thighs, but they could not be distinguished from the tendons of his wrists, which were laid quite bare. His mouth remained wide open, from his eye sockets there darted flames, which seemed to rise up to his hair, and the wretch still walked on. He reached the foot of the terrace. Salammbô was leaning over the balustrade. Those frightful eyeballs were scanning her, and there rose within her a consciousness of all that he had suffered for her. Although he was in his death agony, she could see him once more kneeling in his tent, encircling her waist with his arms, and stammering out gentle words. She thirsted to feel them and to hear them again. She did not want him to die. At this moment Matho gave a great start. She was on the point of shrieking aloud. He fell backwards and did not stir again. Salammbô was borne back, nearly swooning, to her throne by the priests who flocked about her. They congratulated her. It was her work. All clapped their hands and stamped their feet, howling her name. A man darted upon the corpse. Although he had no beard, he had the cloak of a priest of Moloch on his shoulder, and in his belt that species of knife which they employed for cutting up the sacred meat, and which terminated, at the end of the handle, in a golden spatula. He cleft Matho's breast with a single blow, then snatched out the heart and laid it upon the spoon, and Shahabarim, uplifting his arm, offered it to the sun. The sun sank behind the waves. His rays fell like long arrows upon the red heart. As the beatings diminished, the planet sank into the sea, and at the last palpitation it disappeared. Then from the gulf to the lagoon, and from the isthmus to the pharos, in all the streets, on all the houses, and on all the temples, there was a single shout. Sometimes it paused, to be again renewed. The buildings shook with it. Carthage was convulsed, as it were, in the spasm of titanic joy and boundless hope. Narr'Havas, drunk with pride, passed his left arm beneath Salammbô's waist in token of possession, and taking a gold patera in his right hand, he drank to the genius of Carthage. Salammbô rose like her husband, with the cup in her hand, to drink also. She fell down again with her head lying over the back of the throne, pale, stiff, with parted lips, and her loosened hair hung to the ground. Thus died Hamilcar's daughter for having touched the mantle of Tanith. End of chapter 15. End of Salammbô by Gustave Flaubert. Read by Carolyn in Oslo, Norway, and Groningen, the Netherlands. Begun in April 2012 and finished on the 3rd of August 2013. Thank you for listening.